Here's exactly how to automate repetitive construction management tasks using low-cost, no-code software. These are things like filing correspondence, filling out a site diary, or updating registers. Using software like Zapier, or if you're a bit more tech-savvy, N8n, you can easily set up repeatable workflows that run automatically. As long as you can define a clear trigger, an input data, and an output action, you can automate almost anything. We all know how much of construction management is just glorified admin, so being able to master and use tools like this is going to drastically improve your efficiency. So I want to start by showing you a very simple document control system I set up using Airtable and Zapier. All it does is you set up a project email address, for example, projects@yourcompaniesname.com. Every time that email is copied into important correspondence, such as submitting a payment claim or a variation or receiving new drawings from a client, every email you receive goes and gets stored in an Airtable database. If you don't know what Airtable is, it's basically like a fancy Excel that integrates much more seamlessly and effectively with these automation tools and is better for structured data. So every email I receive goes into this correspondence tracker. So you can imagine all the project correspondence would sit here. You've got subject, text, a summary of the email that I was using AI for. And then if an email falls into the category of being an RFI, a variation, or a payment claim, it goes and updates the relevant register, and all the correspondence related to that issue, for example, RFI number 8, gets tracked under this. So RFI 8 is the confirmation of the required insulation thickness. We've got a summary of the correspondence and then a register of all the correspondence around it. This is just a proof of concept. Honestly, once you understand how to do these tools, you can obviously, the beauty of them is you can customize them to the problem you're trying to solve. Zapier is the one I recommend starting with because Zapier is unbelievably easy and it has a huge amount of pre-built tools already integrated into it. N8n, it's a little bit more complex. It has a steeper learning curve. It's more customizable, but for most of the tasks you're doing in tools like Zapier and N8n, you want these pre-built integrations. So for example, there's one with Procore. I don't use Procore, but I know a lot of people do. So these pre-built integrations, being able to choose specific actions that are pre-built and triggered, such as through Procore or QuickBooks or whatever software you use, just make your life much, much easier. So I'd just like to start by making a quick distinction that automation is different to artificial intelligence. Automation is just a deterministic series of steps. It's the same as writing software or writing code. You know, when you press this button, this action happens. AI, again, ChatGPT, Claude, it's this probabilistic model where you input in a series of text or context and it predicts an output. AI can be a tool that you use in an automation, but automations, they're not any AI. It's just a prescriptive series of steps that takes input data, turns it into output data and an action. So when we're talking about automations, these are things like taking the daily weather data and updating an Excel register, monitoring your inbox and turning and updating an RFI register like I showed you. There's no AI in that. That's just simply looking at the tag at the start of the email subject line or having a calendar reminder a week before you attend site to send a follow-up email. These are just automations, no AI in them. AI is very useful within automations, as I'm going to talk about, for things like turning unstructured free text input into structured data. I think that's probably the best use case of AI in these automations. So for example, taking voice notes or a WhatsApp chat, turning that into a site diary would save a lot of people time. Or you can use AI to determine what automation should run. But I'll talk about the applications of AI to an automation, but just want to be clear at the start that these are different concepts. Okay, the next question to ask is, what should you automate? Well, I think there's really two broad categories of reasons to automate. Number one is that it genuinely saves you time. Something I've been seeing a lot and something I've spoken to a lot about people recently is they come up with these automations they want to do, and it's like they're trying to apply an automation to their business rather than looking at their business and seeing what's taking them a lot of time. Like, for example, the other day, I was talking to someone who had been suggested to automate that every time they create a new project, it automatically creates a new project folder. That's a task that you probably do once every month or two max, and it probably takes you 30 seconds to copy the project template and create a new folder. It's not a task you should be automating. It doesn't really save you any time. Automations can be a little bit fickle. You have to check them, you have to set them up. It just genuinely doesn't make any sense to me because it's not really saving you any time. It's not a big time waster. So tasks that save you time generally tend to have some sort of recurrent frequency. For example, that might be daily or weekly. In aggregate, they're quite time consuming and they're predictable and repeatable. For example, if every week or every month you have to send a report to your client of the progress of the project, and it's simply a matter of looking at your schedule, your progress on each of the key tasks, and reformatting that into a report. That would be a very good use case of automation. You would obviously check it before you send it to them, but actually compiling that report would probably save you a fair bit of time. It's done with a regular frequency, and the actual process of compiling the report is predictable and repeatable. The second category of tasks that I would say suit automation well are important things you should do but don't. I think this is an important category of automation because we all know construction is, for want of a better word, relatively a brutal industry. So you look at a project management textbook like the PMBOK, they will tell you there's 1,000 different things you should be doing. You should be filling out all these registers, doing all that stuff. We all know that under the pump on a project, you spend a lot more of your time firefighting than maintaining registers and doing all these things. So these important tasks tend to slip through the cracks. They also tend to have consequences or result in more firefighting when they're missed. So things like logging the weather every day and automatically flagging an extension of time. That has a very predictable input and output. It's something that if you're busy, rushing, doing other stuff, you might forget to do. That is a very good use case of automation. Maintaining an RFI register and every week sending a follow-up to your client with any open actions. Again, it's important. It can be time consuming. It's frequent. If it isn't, it is something you should be doing, but probably aren't doing. Again, good use case of an automation. Even things like you have a cost tracking spreadsheet for the project. All your labor hours go into QuickBooks, taking the hours in QuickBooks and using that to update your cost tracking spreadsheet automatically. So you get a nice cost report and can generate insights and look at cost codes that are flagging as overrunning. It's something you should be doing. It's something that the perfect project would be doing, but you probably don't have time to sit down manually every week and do. Okay, let's break down what an automation actually is. Well, any automation has to start with a trigger. There's something that has to kick off the process. This can be an event-based trigger or a time-based trigger. Then there is some sort of data transformation. For example, in this example, you're taking the weather data through an API. You're then storing that in an Airtable record. So that's the output of the automation, is the update to the Airtable record. Therefore, to automate any tasks, you have to be able to think through what these key steps are. What is the trigger? What kicks it off? What is the transformation to the data? And what is the output action you want to happen? In any automation, there's two types of trigger. You can have an event-based trigger. So for example, a new expense is recorded in your accounting software. You want to update your cost tracking software. A new email received with a subject line RFI, a file is uploaded to the project folder, or a form is submitted. These would be examples of event-based triggers. The other thing around time-based triggers, these are the weekly, monthly, recurring tasks. So for example, every morning you pull the weather data. The 25th of each month, you generate a draft payment claim based on the project progress. Or every Friday, compile a report of the project's progress. So for example, this email correspondence tracker, the trigger to this is a new email being received. This is a progress report automation, and it triggers every week when we pull data from Airtable. We analyze and return the data using AI. So that's an example of a good use of AI within automation. And then we send an outbound email. So that's triggering based on a time frequency. The way you should be looking at and thinking about an automation is the transformation of data. As construction people, this probably isn't something we're hyper aware of, but PDFs have different data formats to Airtable records, which have different formats to Procore site barriers. So the key thing we're thinking about with an automation is what is the input data and what is the output data format, and how do we convert between the two? For example, extracting text from a PDF computationally, or I don't know if computationally is the right word, but using an automation is actually relatively complicated. Or for example, taking an Excel file and updating an Airtable record or sending an email, you're actually, unless there's pre-built automations, which in Zapier there are for dealing with things like Google Sheets and Excel, which make it much easier. But if you're actually taking, passing data and reformatting data, that is actually where a lot of the complexities in these automations live. So the different types of operations we would do to transform data, I'll break them down into simple operations, decision logic, loops, and code. So simple operations would be something like you take field A in an Airtable record and you put it in column B. You're just mapping or moving data, but you're not actually changing the format of the data. It's a number, it's text, it's an Excel file, whatever. You can have simple formula operations. Again, this is something we would be very familiar with using Excel, but the process of taking a certain input column and turning it into another value, for example, hours worked times the labor rate equals a cost, that is actually a very simple automation. Or you can reformat data. For example, you could take dates in the month of day, month, year, and put them in the other order. The next type of transformation we can do is decision logic. So this is where we have an if-then condition. For example, if an expense is greater than $500, say you have an automation where somebody fills out an Airtable form, that gets logged as an expense. If the expense is greater than $500, it has to be approved by the project manager. Or you could have a filter where you only process emails that are from your client. They go into a separate correspondence register. Again, that's looking at the input field, which would be the email from address, and then uses the filter at your client's company to determine which emails get logged. Now, filters generally tend to be binary, yes or no, but you can also have what's referred to as a switch or a router where you have multiple tags that categorize input. For example, electrical stuff goes to the electrical register, RFIs go to the RFI register, hydraulics go to the hydraulics register. We can have a loop. So a loop is for example, each line item in an invoice, you get a PDF document so you get an invoice from a supplier, it has 15 lines. You want to loop through each of those individual lines in your invoice. You want to loop through and create a new record in an Airtable expense tracker. Or for each subcontractor, you have a list of 10 subcontractors, you want to send the same email. So a loop is an iteration. You're doing a task multiple times. And then if none of these categories map to the transformation you want to do, you can actually write custom code. So when you open up Zapier and you can add actions, you can see all these possible steps or transformations you can do. You can have delays, webhooks, which is where you pull data from the internet if it's not already built into a trigger. You can have separate paths. So you could, that switch condition I was talking about, where based on the tag and the email address, you could have different sequences, formatters, human in the loop, all these different things, or AI, which is where you actually put a call to a large language model within the workflow. So this is a more complicated automation I set up that was designed to analyze different types of tender documents, where you have a new project that has a series of tender documents associated with it. It extracts and downloads all the file URLs from Airtable, then loops through these files, determines the files types, splits them into different parts, and breaks them out into separate registers. Now, this is a complicated automation. In my experience, when you start to do automations like this, you run into all sorts of problems. We have so many steps. So my suggestion would always be to have very simple automations, but you can really see what you can build. And again, the power of these tools is that you can customize them to your exact workflow relatively easily without really much technical skill. Now, obviously, the last step in this process is the output. What is the result of the automation when it's completed correctly? It could be update a database in a spreadsheet, create a new record, send an email or a Slack message, generate a PDF, or trigger another separate automation. Now, as I said, AI is a tool that you can use within an automation, but it's fundamentally different to automation. Where AI adds value in automations, the biggest thing I see is you can take unstructured free text data like a WhatsApp chat or unstructured records and turn them into structured data. For example, you could take an invoice. Every supplier sends invoices in a different format. You could extract the relevant cost items from that and turn them into structured data within your cost tracking sheet. You can also use AI for classification and routing within an automation. So the simple way I was talking about before, when you have an expense, if an expense is over $500, it has to go for approval. Well, you could actually have classification and routing via an AI agent that, for example, you get a new RFI, AI does a quick scan to determine if this is a high risk, high consequence RFI that needs to go to the project manager for approval or for their oversight, or the site engineer can just liaise with the client to do it. That's just an example of where you can actually introduce intelligence to assess the risk. Now, as an extension of classification and routing, you can use AI to then determine which action to take. Is the example I said, does the RFI need escalation or not? Or if you're receiving a submittal, is the submittal compliant with the spec? You could automatically reject it or ask your subcontractor to make these improvements based on the AI's first draft, so you're not wasting time reviewing it. Then the final use of AI within an automation is to actually generate information. So this example of generating a progress report, all you're really doing is taking your weekly project progress and putting it into some sort of format, email, report format. Again, that's a good use of AI because it's got a series of data. There's a repeatable process that you're trying to do. You specify the exact input, the output format you want the AI to produce the report in, and the exact steps you want it to take. Now, I already mentioned this point when I was talking about the long, complicated automation for the tender document analysis. Look, the more steps you have in your automations, the more likely they are to break. APIs change settings, so you'll find that the software vendors you're connecting your tools to, they not infrequently change the structures of the APIs. You get more edge cases, but again, it's just this principle, the more steps you have in the process, the more likely something is to break. Now, the other thing I need to talk about is the role of databases. You'll find most automations either rely on data, for example, generating a progress report requires on your weekly progress tracking, or they need to pull and write data to a database. So I've been using Airtable a lot to do this. You can also use Excel, which we all know is the greatest construction software in existence. But basically, this idea of taking data, transforming data, updating records, or using it to generate things like reports or progress updates, it really relies on connecting to databases. So I don't think Excel is necessarily the wrong tool to use. Airtable is just very easy to integrate with these different automations. It has a lot more features. It handles structured data better, and it also has these AI fields that I find very useful for the type of tasks we do. If you're building an estimating spreadsheet or something like that, Airtable isn't the right tool. It's not good for calculations and formulas. It's not as customizable as Excel, but for integrating into automations as the database you're using to track and manage data, I think it is a very good tool. So now I want to show you maybe a slightly more complicated automation database type style system, and this is for a site diary. Now, we all know site diaries are important for tracking what's happening on site so you can get visibility and generate reports around, for example, earned value management. You can see the quantity of work you had planned versus what you're actually doing to know whether you're on schedule. You can look at the costs incurred to do that work versus what you budgeted for on your estimate to see whether you're going over budget. But also site diaries are useful because you've got records of what's happening on site if you ever have to make claims to your client for additional money or to prove things to subcontractors. Now, this one is super simple. It's basically an example I did where you have a site diary, so a form that can get filled out each day where you enter the project name, the status, the supervisor, the weather, the temperature, notes, photos, any photos you want to track, all the employees and what different tasks they worked on, and the quantities of work completed. Now, these quantities of work completed are all tracked against a series of cost codes. So, for example, you have site excavation, the budgeted quantity was 500 meters cubed, the budgeted hours was 200. Against each of these cost codes is where all of the labor hours for the employees get tracked. So every employee who works on a specific task, the hours they work gets tracked against that cost code. And then each day, we're also tracking the quantity of work completed. We can basically take these two sets of data, which is what is entered in the daily diary every day, and then we can generate these reports where we look at the hours logged, the quantity complete, the percentage quantity complete versus the percentage hours worked to calculate our cost performance index to work out if we're under budget or over budget. Now, I'm not saying this is the best way to do it. It's a very simple example, but for example, if you do your hours or your labor hours in QuickBooks, at the start of your job, if you set up some separate, more granular cost codes, you get them to track their hours worked in QuickBooks and use these cost codes as the task description. You could automate a lot of the labor entry, and then all you'd have to do once a week is get someone to enter the quantities of work completed. So there's lots of different ways you could structure this, but basically it's a very easy way to take data, put it into reports, and to get insights from it. So for example, in Airtable as well, you can very quickly create dashboards that show the data being used. Again, this is just an experiment. It's not something I'm using on an actual project, but it's just a cool, like you can begin to see the type of stuff you can build with these simple automation. But again, you just have to revert back to the principles I spoke about at the start, where I think the two roles of these automations and where I actually think they're useful is if it's something that genuinely saves you time, that you're not just, again, something I've been seeing recently, I've spoken to some people about, is people are just almost trying to apply tech and AI for the sake of applying tech and AI. It has to be something that genuinely saves you time. And there are lots of things that waste time on construction that you can automate. So you probably don't have to think long and hard about what to do. The other use case, again, is going back to sort of these core project management principles. What is the stuff that you know you should be doing, like tracking correspondence, putting in notices as soon as things come up? What are the sort of things like that that you know you should be doing but aren't doing? Okay, my key takeaways, again, I was just saying this, automate the right things. Don't try and automate stuff that takes you 2 minutes to do or wouldn't actually save you time. Next one is automation is different to artificial intelligence. Automation is prescriptive. It's just a set series of steps that are in a task. You can use AI within an automation, but you don't necessarily have to. Any automation has 3 parts: the trigger, the transformation, the output. There are some good roles for AI in automation, like taking unstructured data and turning it into structured data, classification, deciding whether to act amongst certain risk thresholds. Then when you're building automations, the more steps you have in a process, the more risk you'll have. Databases are the backbone to automation. So whether you use Excel or something like Airtable, you have to get good at thinking about how to structure data so you can get useful insights from it. And again, the key takeaway I'd say is start super simple. One trigger, one transformation, one output that does something genuinely useful that will save you time. You can set these things up in literally 10 minutes in Zapier. Maybe it'll be a bit slower the first time as you've never done it before, but they're genuinely super easy to use and super user friendly.